The wind carried the sharp scent of pine and fresh-cut timber across the quiet valley of Dry Creek, Wyoming. Every sunrise began the same way. Storekeepers swept their porches, ranch hands drove cattle through the dusty streets, and children chased one another between wagons before the school bell rang. Yet every morning, another sound echoed louder than all the rest, the rhythmic pounding of a hammer striking wood. Bang, bang, bang. The steady blows came from the largest workshop on the edge of town, where a solitary man shaped wagon wheels, repaired broken carriages, and built some of the strongest freight wagons in the territory. His name was Elias Turner. Everyone admitted he was the finest wagon builder for 100 miles, but almost no one dared look him in the face. 5 years earlier, a terrible explosion had ripped through the old sawmill outside Dry Creek. The fire spread so quickly that dozens of workers became trapped beneath collapsing beams. While others fled for safety, Elias ran into the inferno again and again, dragging injured men into the open until the roof finally collapsed around him. He survived. The flames did not spare his face. The right side of his jaw had been twisted by fire. Thick scars climbed from his neck to his temple, leaving one eyebrow permanently missing and his skin rough like weathered leather. His right ear had been badly burned, and a deep scar crossed his forehead like a lightning bolt. The town called him a hero for exactly 1 week. After that, they simply called him frightening. Children hid behind their mothers whenever he passed. Visitors often stared before quickly pretending not to notice. Women lowered their eyes and crossed to the opposite side of the street. The whispers always followed. Poor man. What a terrible face. No decent woman would marry him. Elias heard every word. Eventually, he stopped trying to greet people altogether. His workshop became his entire world. From sunrise until long after darkness covered the valley, he buried himself in work. Wagons left his shop stronger than when they were new. Ranchers trusted his craftsmanship more than anyone else's. Travelers gladly paid his prices because they knew his work would survive mountain trails that destroyed ordinary wagons. Still, when evening arrived and every customer returned home to family, Elias locked the workshop alone. His only companion was an old shepherd mix named Scout, whose gray muzzle showed nearly as many years as Elias's own tired eyes. Scout never cared about scars. Each night, the faithful dog curled beside the fireplace while Elias ate simple meals of beans, bread, and black coffee without speaking a single word. Silence filled every corner of the cabin. One cold October evening, Elias sat staring into the fire longer than usual. "I'm 36 years old," he muttered quietly. Scout lifted his head. "I've built half the wagons in this county, and not one soul waits for me at supper." The dog simply wagged his tail. Elias gave a tired smile. "You've been better company than most folks." The following morning, instead of beginning another wagon, Elias rode into town carrying a folded piece of paper. Inside the newspaper office, the elderly editor looked over his spectacles. "What can I do for you?" "I'd like to place an advertisement." The editor dipped his pen into ink. "What sort?" Elias hesitated before answering. "A marriage notice." The old man blinked. "You certain?" Elias nodded. The editor slowly began writing while Elias carefully chose every word. "Honest wagon builder from Dry Creek seeks a wife willing to build a peaceful home in the Wyoming Territory. Financially secure. Hardworking. I carry visible scars from an accident years ago and ask only for honesty instead of judgment. Travel expenses provided." The editor looked up. "You sure you want to mention the scars? I'd rather disappoint no one." The newspaper was printed 2 days later and sent east by rail. Weeks passed. Elias almost convinced himself no woman would ever answer. Then, nearly 1,500 miles away in Savannah, Georgia, a woman unfolded that very newspaper while sitting beside the window of a fading plantation house. Margaret Collins had spent most of her life hearing people describe her before they ever spoke to her. Too large, too heavy, too embarrassing. At 32 years old, she had attended countless social gatherings only to become the subject of whispered jokes. Dresses had to be specially sewn for her broad frame, and every formal dinner seemed to include someone pretending kindness while quietly mocking her appearance. After her parents died, she moved in with distant relatives who tolerated her presence only because they believed she had nowhere else to go. Every breakfast began with criticism. You really shouldn't take another biscuit. You'd find a husband if you lost some weight. No gentleman wants a wife who fills an entire doorway. Margaret smiled politely every time. Then she cried alone every night. Unlike the women around her, Margaret loved reading, bookkeeping, gardening, and cooking. She dreamed of a peaceful home where no one measured her worth by the size of her waist. One rainy afternoon, she unfolded the latest newspaper. Most advertisements blurred together until one sentence caught her eye. I ask only for honesty instead of judgment. She read it twice, then a third time. No promises of beauty, no demands for perfection, just honesty. For the first time in years, she felt someone understood loneliness without ever meeting her. That evening she wrote a letter. Mr. Turner, I believe it is only fair that I describe myself truthfully. Society has never considered me attractive. I am a woman of generous size and have endured years of ridicule because of it. Yet I know how to manage a household, keep honest accounts, and offer loyalty to those who show kindness. If your words are sincere, perhaps two lonely people might build something better together. She folded the letter carefully before sealing it. Nearly 3 weeks later, Elias opened the envelope inside his quiet cabin. He read every line twice, then once more. He wasn't thinking about Margaret's appearance. He noticed her honesty. Her handwriting was graceful. Her words carried dignity instead of self-pity. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to him without fear. The next morning, he purchased a train ticket with nearly a month's earnings enclosed inside another letter. Miss Collins, if your heart remains unchanged, come to Dry Creek. I cannot promise luxury, but I can promise respect, hard work, and a place where you will never be mocked inside my home. I only hope my appearance does not send you back on the next train. Margaret smiled as tears filled her eyes. She packed a single trunk. 3 weeks later, news spread across Dry Creek faster than wildfire. The wagon builder's bride is arriving on today's train. By noon, nearly the entire town had gathered beside the depot, eager to witness what everyone expected would become another humiliation for the lonely man nobody wanted. The train screeched to a stop beneath a cloud of steam, and every conversation on the platform suddenly died away. Ranchers leaned against fence posts. Merchants stepped out of their stores, and curious children climbed onto wooden crates for a better view. The conductor placed the boarding step onto the platform and called for the remaining passengers. A traveling salesman stepped down, then an elderly couple. Finally, a woman appeared in the doorway. Margaret Collins paused for a moment, gripping the brass handrail. The long journey from Georgia had exhausted her. Her navy blue traveling dress fit neatly, but could not hide her broad frame. A gentle breeze tugged at the brim of her hat as she looked over the crowd waiting below. The silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then came the whispers. So that's her. She's even bigger than they said. Poor Elias. A few men chuckled openly. Margaret's heart sank. Nothing had changed. No matter how far she traveled, people always looked at her the same way. She lowered her eyes, wondering if she should simply step back inside the train before anyone noticed. Then the crowd slowly parted. Elias Turner stepped forward. He wore his cleanest brown coat, polished boots, and a freshly brushed black hat. In one hand, he held a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered that morning from the hills surrounding Dry Creek. As he removed his hat, the afternoon sunlight revealed every scar that crossed his face. Margaret gasped softly. His injuries were far worse than she had imagined. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The townspeople waited for her to scream or for him to lower his head in shame. Instead, Elias climbed onto the first wooden step and extended his hand. Miss Collins. His deep voice was calm. I'm Elias. Margaret looked into his eyes. She didn't see anger. She didn't see bitterness. She saw the same loneliness she had carried for most of her own life. Slowly, she placed her hand into his. It's a pleasure to meet you, she answered quietly. Elias smiled. It wasn't a perfect smile because of the scars along his jaw, but it was sincere. He carefully helped her down the steep train steps without rushing her or making her feel embarrassed. Once both feet touched the platform, he offered her the bouquet. I wasn't sure what flowers you liked. Margaret accepted them with genuine surprise. They're beautiful. They looked prettier before I squeezed them all morning. She laughed. It was the first genuine laugh Elias had heard in years. Ignoring every whisper around them, he picked up her suitcase. Our home is just outside town. He offered his arm. Margaret accepted it without hesitation. Together they walked through the silent crowd. No one dared speak as the unlikely couple disappeared down the dusty road. That evening, Reverend Samuel Brooks married them inside the small wooden church overlooking Dry Creek. Only 4 people attended. The Reverend, his elderly wife, the church pianist, and Scout, who wandered through the open doorway halfway through the ceremony before lying beside Elias's boots. When the vows ended, Margaret couldn't help smiling. I suppose that makes your dog our first wedding guest. Elias chuckled. He usually goes wherever he pleases. Their laughter echoed through the empty church. It was a simple wedding. No orchestra, no elegant feast, no cheering crowd. Yet both of them quietly felt something neither had experienced before. Acceptance. As sunset painted the mountains orange, they reached the small cabin beside Elias's wagon workshop. The home wasn't fancy. The porch leaned slightly. The roof had been patched more than once. Inside stood a sturdy dining table, a stone fireplace, handmade shelves, and a rocking chair worn smooth with years of use. Margaret slowly looked around. It feels peaceful. I was afraid you'd think it too small. She smiled. I've lived in much larger houses that never once felt like home. Elias set her suitcase near the bedroom door. I'm not much a decorator. I noticed. He blinked, then realized she was teasing him. Both of them laughed again. That evening they shared stew, fresh bread, and hot coffee. The conversation was awkward at first. Neither knew exactly what to say. Finally, Margaret placed her spoon on the table. I've been wondering something. Elias looked up. When you saw me today, she hesitated. Were you disappointed? The room became quiet except for the crackling fire. Elias rested his elbows on the table. Can I answer honestly? I prefer that. I wasn't disappointed. She looked uncertain. I was surprised. Margaret nodded slowly. I expected that. So was I. She frowned. You were. I imagined someone shorter. For the first time in many years, Margaret burst into laughter so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. When her laughter settled, Elias smiled warmly. I wasn't expecting anyone perfect. I've never been called perfect. I don't need perfect. He met her eyes. I needed someone kind. Margaret's smile slowly faded into something softer. I've spent years believing no one would ever say those words to me. Elias looked toward the fire. When I walk through town, people stare at these scars before they ever see the man wearing them. Margaret quietly nodded. And when people meet me, she whispered, they never bother learning my name. Neither spoke for several moments. Then Elias extended his hand across the table. I think the world has been unfair to both of us. Margaret placed her hand in his. I think you're right. From that evening forward, something changed between them. Not love. Not yet. Something quieter. Trust. Over the following weeks, Margaret transformed the cabin. She stitched fresh curtains from old fabric. She planted herbs beside the porch. She organized shelves that had remained cluttered for years. The smell of fresh bread soon replaced the scent of sawdust inside the house. Elias found himself hurrying home each evening instead of working after dark. For the first time in years, someone waited for him. Meanwhile, Margaret discovered stacks of unpaid invoices buried beneath dusty ledgers. Elias, she said one evening while flipping through the books, you repaired 3 freight wagons for the Carter Ranch. I remember. They only paid you for one. He shrugged. They said money was tight. She looked at him over the ledger. And you believe them? I didn't want an argument. Margaret smiled knowingly. You build the strongest wagons in Wyoming. I suppose. You deserve to be paid honestly. The following morning she sat behind the workshop desk with ink, paper, and perfect handwriting. When customers arrived, They found a polite but confident woman keeping careful records of every payment. Within days, word spread that Elias Turner finally had someone looking after his business. Not everyone approved. One afternoon, Margaret visited the general store to buy flour, sugar, and lamp oil. As she reached the counter, a loud ranch hand named Calvin Briggs leaned against a barrel and smirked. "Looks like Turner's been feeding his new wife mighty well." Several men laughed. Margaret felt the familiar sting of humiliation. For one brief moment, she considered leaving. Instead, she remembered the man who had offered his hand at the train station without a trace of shame. She slowly turned toward Calvin. "My size has never hurt anyone," she said calmly. "But a cruel tongue often does." The laughter stopped. Just then the store door opened. Heavy boots crossed the wooden floor. Elias stood quietly in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the ranch hand. Without raising his voice, he spoke a single sentence. "You owe my wife an apology." The entire store fell silent. Calvin Briggs looked from Elias's scarred face to the heavy oak club resting beside the workshop door just outside. The ranch hand had always enjoyed mocking people weaker than himself, but there was nothing weak about the man standing before him. The store fell so quiet that even the ticking wall clock seemed unusually loud. Calvin forced a grin. It was only a joke. Elias took another slow step forward. "My wife didn't laugh." The words were calm, almost gentle, but everyone inside the store could hear the warning behind them. Calvin swallowed. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he finally removed his hat. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Turner." Margaret simply nodded. "Thank you." She gathered her groceries and walked toward the door. Elias carried the flour sack onto his shoulder and followed beside her without another word. The customers watched them leave. Something had changed. The scarred wagon builder they once mocked had become a husband who stood beside his wife without hesitation. And the woman they expected to break under ridicule had answered cruelty with quiet dignity instead of tears. From that day forward, the whispers around Dry Creek became noticeably quieter. Back at the workshop, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Margaret handled every order, payment, and receipt with remarkable precision. She discovered customers who still owed money from repairs completed months earlier and politely collected every dollar. Within weeks, the business began earning more than Elias had ever imagined. "You've doubled my savings," Elias admitted one evening while studying the ledger. Margaret smiled. "No." He looked confused. "I simply made sure people paid what your work is worth." Elias laughed softly. "I spent years fixing wagons, and I spent years balancing household accounts." She closed the ledger. "I believe we're quite a good team." For the first time in his life, Elias allowed himself to imagine a future instead of merely surviving each day. He repaired the porch. He expanded the stable. He even began sketching plans for a larger workshop. But success often attracts unwanted attention. Just beyond Dry Creek stretched thousands of acres owned by Victor Harlan, one of the wealthiest railroad investors in the Wyoming Territory. Harlan cared little for the town itself. He cared about water. A clear mountain spring flowed across the edge of Elias's property before winding through the valley. Engineers had recently informed Harlan that controlling that spring would make it much easier to build a supply station for the expanding railroad. Unfortunately for him, Elias owned the land. One bright autumn afternoon, 3 expensive carriages rolled into the workshop yard. Out stepped Victor Harlan. His tailored black coat contrasted sharply with the dusty boots of local ranchers. A silver pocket watch hung from his vest, and polished riding gloves covered his hands. 2 armed guards followed behind him. Margaret noticed them through the cabin window. "Elias," she called quietly, "you have visitors." Elias wiped the sawdust from his hands before walking outside. "What can I do for you?" Harlan looked around the property with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "You've built yourself a respectable business. I've worked hard for it. I'll make this simple." Harlan unfolded a document. "I wish to purchase your land." Elias remained silent. "You'll receive $2,000. It was more money than most people in Dry Creek would see in several years. Many men would have accepted without hesitation. Elias didn't even glance at the paper. It isn't for sale. Harlan smiled as though speaking to a stubborn child. Perhaps you didn't hear the amount. I heard. You could buy a larger property elsewhere. My wife planted her first garden here. He pointed toward the workshop. I built this place with my own hands. Then toward the cabin. We built our home together. Finally, he met Harlan's eyes. So no, the investor's smile disappeared. I rarely hear that word. You'll have to grow accustomed to it. Without another sentence, Elias turned and walked back toward his workshop. Harlan's face hardened. You may regret this decision. Elias didn't bother turning around. I already regret wasting my afternoon. The wealthy investor climbed into his carriage and left without another word. Margaret stepped onto the porch. I don't believe he's finished. Neither do I. The trouble began only days later. Someone cut the fence surrounding the pasture. A valuable workhorse disappeared overnight. Large wagon wheels stacked beside the workshop were mysteriously damaged. Anonymous notes appeared beneath the front door. Sell the land. Last warning. Margaret carefully unfolded each message before placing it into a small wooden box. We should show these to the sheriff. We will. Sheriff Daniel Hayes listened carefully, but frowned. I can't arrest anyone without proof. So we wait. Margaret asked. For now. Winter arrived earlier than expected. Snow blanketed the valley, and icy winds howled across the mountains after sunset. One particularly bitter night, Margaret sat near the fireplace, mending one of Elias's work shirts while he finished sharpening tools in the workshop. Scout suddenly lifted his head. The old dog growled. Margaret looked toward the window. What is it, boy? A strange smell drifted through the room. Smoke. Not from the fireplace. From outside. She rushed to the window. Flames climbed the side of the workshop roof. Elias. He burst through the workshop door just as another glass bottle crashed against the wall, exploding into fire. 3 masked riders circled the building, hurling bottles filled with burning oil. Get water, Elias shouted. He grabbed a bucket and sprinted toward the flames. Before he reached the well, another figure emerged from behind a wagon. A heavy wooden beam slammed into Elias's shoulder. The powerful blow threw him into the snow. 2 more attackers rushed forward, kicking him before he could stand. Margaret watched from the porch in horror. Fear gripped her for only a single heartbeat. Then it vanished. She looked beside the workshop entrance. Leaning against the wall stood Elias's enormous splitting maul, the heavy tool he used to break thick timber. Without thinking, she seized the long wooden handle. The weapon was almost too heavy to lift. Almost. She charged through the snow. Leave him alone. One attacker turned just in time to see her racing toward him. Instead of slowing down, Margaret drove her shoulder into his chest with every ounce of strength she possessed. The collision knocked him flat into a pile of firewood. The second attacker raised his club. Margaret swung the heavy maul in a wide arc. It smashed into the frozen ground inches from his boots, sending splinters of ice and dirt flying. The sheer force of the impact terrified him. He stumbled backward. Elias seized the opportunity. Despite the pain in his shoulder, he tackled the man into the snow. The third attacker glanced from the burning workshop to the furious couple standing together. His courage disappeared. Run! Within seconds, all 3 riders disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only hoofprints, scattered fire, and one dropped leather satchel that would soon reveal exactly who had sent them. The leather satchel lay half buried in the snow where one of the attackers had dropped it during his desperate escape. Elias picked it up carefully while Margaret and Scout stamped out the last of the flames creeping along the workshop wall. Inside were several folded papers, a handful of silver coins, and a sealed letter bearing the initials VH. Margaret unfolded the document with trembling hands. It wasn't a contract. It was a list of instructions. Burn the workshop. Force Turner off the property. Leave no witnesses if necessary. Neither of them spoke. The words were enough to explain everything. Within 20 minutes, Sheriff Daniel Hayes arrived with a group of townspeople carrying buckets, lanterns, and blankets. The fire had badly scorched one side of the workshop, but the quick response had saved the building from complete destruction. The sheriff examined the letter beneath the glow of his lantern. His face hardened. This changes everything. By sunrise, deputies rode to Victor Harlan's ranch with arrest warrants signed by the county judge. The wealthy investor was furious. "You have no proof," he shouted. Sheriff Hayes calmly placed the leather satchel on his desk. "I believe your own signature says otherwise." By noon, Victor Harlan was sitting in the county jail awaiting trial, while the captured attacker confessed that Harlan had promised each man a large payment for driving Elias and Margaret away. News traveled quickly across Wyoming. People who had once laughed at the scarred wagon builder now spoke about the brave husband who refused to abandon his home. They also spoke about the fearless woman who had charged through fire and snow to save his life. For the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, Margaret walked through town without hearing a single cruel remark. Instead, strangers tipped their hats. Some even smiled. A week later, Mayor Walter Pierce knocked on the Turners' front door. He removed his hat before speaking. "Elias, Margaret, I owe both of you an apology." Neither interrupted him. "I stood by for years while this town judged good people by appearances." He looked down at the porch. "I should have spoken sooner." Margaret exchanged a quiet glance with Elias. "The past can't be changed," she said gently. "No," the mayor replied, "but perhaps the future can." The following Saturday, something remarkable happened. Before sunrise, wagons began arriving outside the damaged workshop. One by one, carpenters climbed down carrying lumber. Blacksmiths unloaded iron fittings. Ranchers brought fresh timber. Shopkeepers delivered food for the workers. Even children carried nails and buckets of paint. Elias looked around in complete disbelief. "What is all this?" The mayor smiled. A town finally trying to do the right thing. For the next several weeks, nearly every family in Dry Creek volunteered their time. The damaged workshop wasn't simply repaired. It was rebuilt larger than before. A stronger roof replaced the old one. New storage barns were added behind the main building. Fresh windows overlooked the valley. When construction finally ended, the workshop had become the finest wagon shop in the county. Elias stood silently in the doorway, unable to find words. Margaret slipped her hand into his. "You earned this." He shook his head. "We earned it." Life slowly settled into a happier rhythm than either of them had ever imagined. The business flourished. Travelers from neighboring towns came specifically to purchase Elias's wagons, knowing they were built with unmatched craftsmanship. Margaret continued managing every account with careful precision. No payment was forgotten. No customer left dissatisfied. As their savings grew, Margaret suggested something close to her heart. "There are children in this town who've lost parents." Elias nodded. "I know. What if we opened our home every Sunday afternoon? For dinner and for lessons?" Within a month, half a dozen orphan children gathered around their dining table each weekend. Margaret taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, and bookkeeping. Elias showed them how to repair wheels, shape wood, and care for horses. The little cabin that had once echoed with silence became filled with laughter. Scout loved every minute of it. Years passed. The lonely wagon builder no longer ate supper alone. The woman who had once hidden from cruel whispers now walked proudly through town with her head held high. Neither had changed physically. Elias still carried the scars that crossed his face. Margaret remained a woman of generous size. But something far more important had changed. The people around them had finally learned to see beyond appearances. One bright summer afternoon, Dry Creek celebrated its annual Founders Festival. Music filled the streets. Children raced homemade wagons down the hill. Families gathered beneath colorful banners hanging between buildings. Near sunset, Mayor Pierce stepped onto the wooden stage in the town square. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "today we honor two people who reminded this town what courage truly looks like." The crowd applauded as Elias and Margaret were invited forward. Neither enjoyed attention, but they accepted the recognition with quiet humility. The mayor presented them with a beautifully carved wooden plaque. Across the front were simple words: "Character is greater than appearance." The applause grew louder. Elias looked across the crowd. Years earlier, many of these same faces had turned away from him. Today they smiled. He cleared his throat. I spent much of my life believing scars made a man less worthy. The crowd listened in complete silence. My wife taught me something different. He looked at Margaret. People aren't measured by the faces they wear. He paused. They're measured by the hearts they carry. Margaret squeezed his hand before stepping forward herself. I once believed there was no place in this world for someone who looked like me. She smiled warmly at the children sitting near the front of the stage. I was wrong. Her voice remained gentle. If you ever meet someone who looks different, don't decide who they are before learning their name. Many in the audience lowered their heads, remembering their own past mistakes. As evening settled over Dry Creek, lanterns glowed along the streets while music drifted through the cool mountain air. Elias and Margaret quietly slipped away from the celebration and walked back toward the hill overlooking their home. The rebuilt workshop stood proudly beside the cabin, its windows glowing with warm light. Scout trotted happily ahead, chasing grasshoppers through the field. Elias wrapped one arm around Margaret's shoulders. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't answered that advertisement? Margaret smiled as she rested her head against him. I don't. No. I know exactly what would have happened. He looked at her curiously. We both would have kept searching for a place to belong. She looked toward the home they had built together. Instead, we found each other. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the Wyoming mountains, leaving the valley wrapped in golden twilight. Side by side, the couple who had once been rejected by the world stood watching the home they had built, not with wealth or beauty, but with loyalty, courage, and unconditional love. Their story became a lasting reminder throughout the frontier that the strongest foundations are never built on appearances, but on the hearts of those brave enough to see beyond them.